Welcome to the Content Strategy Interviews podcast. Each week, we talk with accomplished content strategy experts to share their wisdom with our friends in the content community. And now here's your host, Larry Swanson.
Hey everyone, welcome to episode number 29 of the Content Strategy Interviews podcast. I'm really happy today to have with us Malaika Carpenter. She's an independent content strategist in Philadelphia, and I'll let Malaika tell you a little bit more about her background. Welcome.
Thank you, Larry. Thank you so much for having me. I'm really excited to talk to you today. So I am founder and principal consultant of Sacred Media Group. Pretty much we are a content strategy consultancy that helps companies articulate their value through concise and compelling content that delivers results. And essentially what I do is help companies build and share their brand story. And I help them by getting them clear on their why. And the why to me is what your brand vision is and your value proposition is. And then taking that and crafting strategies for creating different types of content that ultimately pulls their audience in and then keeps them coming back for more. So that's what I do.
That's a great, concise description of a practice. I love that. And you work mostly in the healthcare sector, I think. Is that true?
Yeah, so I have a background in healthcare. So prior to really getting into content strategy, I started my career as a pharmaceutical sales representative. So I was that person coming in and out of doctors' offices, talking to the doctors and the staff and about the products that I was carrying. But through those experiences, I was understanding, how doctors educate their patients about disease states, about treatment options, and then whether or not those patients were really understanding that information. And so those conversations that were happening in practices really got me interested of how do we better communicate those things and how do we better educate people about their health and wellness? And that sort of continued this passion for doing communications within that sector. And then I ended up getting my master's in communications from Rutgers University in New Jersey. And I really focused in health communication. And with that sort of specialization, a lot of what you are trained in doing is actually in a lot of persuasion theories and behavior change. So my background was doubling down on sales, which is a lot about persuasion, but looking at it from a different coin when I got into my master's, which is how do we change people's behaviors to have more healthier behaviors? And then that sort of evolved as I continued in my career. I had moved from being a pharmaceutical sales rep into doing corporate communications. And that really pushed this passion to really explore how I could do some healthcare marketing stuff. So a lot of the different organizations I've worked with have been within healthcare and have been within health and wellness. And just with that focus of how do you create content that compels people to just make healthier choices and decisions. So yes, that's sort of how I fell into it.
And maybe actually change their behavior. That's what, we all have purpose and intent when we publish content, and you did. I didn't realize I started my career right out of college. I was a college textbook sales rep, which is almost completely analogous to pharma sales, and so I totally get that. And I wonder, there's so many people in this field come from just pure journalism or writing or copywriting or other kind of backgrounds. Do you feel like that gives you a leg up having that sales experience in the background?
Absolutely. So it's very interesting. I knew from a very young age that I was going to be a writer of some sort. I just knew that I was going to be a storyteller. I was such an avid reader, so I was so fascinated by how language can create these pictures in our heads and sort of create these whole worlds and sort of really inspire us and sometimes compel us to do a thing. But I was always fascinated by that. So I always knew that. So even when I, was intentional about pursuing marketing in my studies and then later communications in my studies, I still was in college, I was still a part of our university's newspaper. I also had did some work study in the university's college textbook publisher as well.
Okay.
So I was always sort of exploring like publishing and journalism in some way. And it's very interesting. When I went for college, I went to Temple University in Philadelphia. And while I was a student there, I was writing occasionally. And I eventually became the news editor of Temple News. And I was the only person that was a business student in the business school out of all the other journalism majors that worked in the newsroom. And I think it baffled a lot of people as to like, why are you here? Like, how did that happen? How did that work out? But I think just me not having like that subject matter, like just specifically having that depth in that, I think opened it up to being able to see different story opportunities and being able to like bring in different people who have different perspectives, but who can articulate themselves really, really well. And then I think what also happened was like, I was understanding how to connect the writing that I'm doing to a business goal. And when you think about content strategy, essentially that's what you're doing. So it's like, you're not just being a really good copywriter, but you're being a strategic thinker. And when you're a strategic thinker, you have to think in goals. Like, you have to be very intentional. And then you have to say, what are all the creative things that I can create that helps me to realize that intention?
To accomplish that. Yeah.
Exactly.
No,
Absolutely.
I love that. It's like you have an unfair advantage, it seems like, compared to all of us journalism majors and that came in. No, but because I think the key thing to content strategy is balancing those business needs, and then also as a salesperson, I'm sure you got a lot of empathy for your customers, and that's the second. I would argue that those are the two top things: is that business intent, being clear in that, but also being really focused on your customers and your readers and your users, whatever you call them, and what.
Yeah.
Is that a valid assumption?
Oh, you are like dead on. That is so true, because you can't be effective in communicating a message if you don't understand what your audience really cares about. So it's like, as a sales rep, I learned that really fast because, when you're doing content strategy, you're creating things for the web. So you're creating things for people that you might not ever see. But when you're a sales rep, I'm gonna see you and I might have to see you every week. So I'm gonna see you on the days where I said my message perfectly in the exact way that the marketing team would want me to say it. And it fell on a face that's like blank, doesn't care, nothing resonated. Maybe they gave you the nice nod. Okay, cool. Do you need me to sign for samples? All right, see you next time. And you're like, well, what happened? Did it like work? And then you have those other times where you come back in and you're like, I'm going to throw that script out. I'm going to take the principles of that script, but I'm going to throw it out and I'm going to show up and be a human. And I'm going to fit all the points I want to say around, say, hey, doctor, you're probably about to walk in on a patient that might be experiencing X, Y, and Z. If not right now, maybe at some point today, you might want to think about da, 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 da. Oh, okay, yeah, that makes sense. Thank you. And now it's like a totally different reaction. But like, as a sales rep, you have that advantage of like playing with different messages and seeing automatically how people respond, And so we can do that as content strategists and content creators in a variety of different ways digitally. So that's great. But it's like that, I feel like that is something that I have in my back pocket that some other folks don't have. And so whenever I'm creating something, I try to think like, if I was gonna give this email, or if someone's gonna come to my site and I was the person that would welcome them as if they were coming into the door of like my shop or my home, like, does this sound appropriate?
Right.
Does it, and I think about it like that.
No, I totally get that. And that, because there's so, the hope and potential and everybody's dream is like with digital media is like, yeah, we just measure everything and it tells us how effective things are. But no, you still have to look at human beings in the eye and get that. So you, having done that sales thing, you sort of have you have a jump start there that like in terms of, but let me jump ahead a little bit to like, how do you, I know one of the things you talked about, I'm going to back up real quickly and say how I met Malaika is I was at Confab, and she did this great presentation on solo content strategy practice, which I really enjoyed. And one of the things you talked about was the importance of like process and also measure. And I forget, I'm saying measurement, but like, you know, evaluating the effectiveness of content. So can you talk a little bit about those two things, whether, you know, how they go together, like how well, I guess first talk about the process, I think, because that's, I think, so important when because typically content strategy happens in the context of a big team, but usually like you're the content person and you're working with other people. So I'm assuming that process is super important in kind of managing your role in that. Tell me a little bit about that, like how you do that.
Absolutely. So when I got into doing content strategy, it was bridged from, like I said, my background started in pharmaceuticals. So I was doing like a corporate comms role. And then I just was, there was a layoff, and then I transitioned. And so I actually, at the time, my really good friend had started her own tech startup. And so I used it as an opportunity to take my skills and be able to like offer it to other startups who were really just trying to figure out, how do we have a strong pitch? And then how do we use that pitch not only for investors, but for customers, and so on and so forth. And ultimately, me really being a solo content strategist started out of me initially creating my consultancy.
Mm-hmm.
And then from there, you know, subcontracting on a couple projects, and then also working, I work with a tech startup in Philadelphia, and I've been working with them for the last 2 years. And once again, like I was within many startups I've worked with, the only person who had, subject matter expertise in content strategy. So they were kind of like, whatever you say, like, we try it out, we trust you, like, we believe that you can do this. So it was really just me to not only come up with the ideas, but it was like, as you come up with that idea, go execute it. And so that really put me in the seat of not only coming up with strategy, presenting that idea, but literally maybe as soon as you turn your heels and come out of that meeting, you're now like, let me put the tactical hat on and like get my pen and paper out and like pull up my laptop, or, you know, get my sticky notes out, because I now have to put these ideas like into practice. So I was doing everything from strategy to execution. And from doing that big process, I had to sit down and say, how do I structure my time? Because it's very easy to sort of get overwhelmed, particularly when you might come out of one meeting and execute on another idea, but then you might have to come over here and say, can you run this workshop with another client? Or, you know, so you're working on several different projects all at the same time. So you have to take a step back and say, what are all of my steps that get me to done? And then maybe work backwards from there. So it's kind of like, I started to look at the content strategy process as like, I'm making something for dinner, you know? And we spent some time being like, well, what do we want to eat? What's everyone's appetite? Sort of thing. And that's like the brainstorming that you do. And you take that and you're like, okay, so now I'm going to meal plan, right? And so you start to meal plan, and then you take that back and you're like, so based on these meals and all your preferences and tastes, does this align? Yes, it does. Okay, cool. So now I got to go make the meal. So now I have to break my meals down into like, what are all the ingredients to make a thing? And how long is it going to take? And do I have that specific pan, or, you know, the right oven or whatever to do all of those things? Now that's me assessing, do I have the resources to do all of those things? Do I have the budget to go buy my ingredients, right? So like all of these things.
That.
So I really started to sit down, because I'm like, I have to build this meal and make it done, and at least taste test it, right? And that's where the measuring comes in. So that's how I really started to look at my work. And so in my talk that I did at Confab, I really broke down, like, you need to look at your full process and literally break down each stage. And then in each stage, you need to break down who's involved in that stage. You also need to break down like what tasks are you doing in that stage and what resources, if anything, do you need, including budget. And I think the more clear you are on that, the more clarity it helps with setting expectations for people who don't do content, but you need to be helping you to do content, right? And when I say they don't do content, I mean, they're not the ones sitting down to write messages. They're not the ones who's thinking very editorially, right? So they don't necessarily do that, but you still need them to inform what you're going to make. And so they're really, really important, and you need them to be on your side so that you feel supported. Even if you are the one executing the work, you feel supported in doing the work. And then you need to know how to replicate the whole thing all over again. And so that's where structure became really important to me, because I realized like none of the stuff I was doing was one-off. It was something that I would have to do again and again.
Right.
And so if I had structure around my process, I could continue to do that thing again and again and do it as fast as I was being required to do it. And that's where a lot of the structure came from.
Let me ask you a little bit about that, because there are two things in there. One, I can see how it would benefit both you and your practice and the clients to do it in a consistent, process-oriented way. But to counter that, I interviewed Jared. You know Jared Spool, the UX guy? I interviewed him a couple months ago.
Yeah.
And something like, this quote he said, it just echoes in my head ever since then. He said, everything is bespoke nowadays. Everything is unique. Each organization, each project, everything has its unique things. So I'm actually on a similar, I had been working on it, and your talk at Confab actually inspired me even further. I've been working on this kind of DIY content strategy idea, trying to help all my, like in the people who could never afford, like me or you, but who still need content strategy, you know? So, so I've been also working on articulating a process, and I think I've come up with a pretty decent articulation of it. But does that generally work? Like this process you've come up with, have you hit any glitches, or does it generally work from client to client pretty well?
Yeah, I would say when I think about it, it's more of the building blocks, right? Like, for example, yes, I do agree with Jared in the sense that, you know, every organization is unique, right? However, it's sort of like, if I could use an analogy of like a car maker, like they can have different model of cars, but how they make a car is usually a pretty standard process, right? And there might be certain things that like might be, we have to kind of do it in a very custom way when the car gets to this process, but still all of those pieces are still, I would call like the building blocks of what you do. And so I would say it's good to at least have those building blocks laid out. And then in those areas where you might have to drill down a little bit or sort of test things a little bit differently, like that's where the custom work sort of comes in. But I would say like when I just go a little deeper with that, I would say when I'm talking about the building blocks, I would say that process of like getting in a room and helping you articulate why, like helping you know what vision, mission, how those things articulate into goals, how you could take those big goals and articulate those into message goals. Like those to me still are all the building blocks you need. And it doesn't matter how unique your organization is. Those building blocks will always be consistent. And then taking that work, that research work you do, and then moving it into that next phase of like planning and thinking about the different types of content that you could create based on that information that you know, like that's your next building block. So I just feel like there's certain building blocks in that process. And then there's going to be those moments once you get, I feel like certain things get really custom once you get to the tactical execution piece of it, in my view. And that's where you need to start playing with very unique things in terms of like understanding. I've worked a lot in the B2B space, so maybe understanding my customers and user, or just really understanding that organization's customers and users like in general. And then you might have to tweak some things. So I do agree with that. But I also feel like that's where you have to leave room to be flexible. But I do feel like when you have templated solutions. It's sort of like the lines that you can play within, but maybe how you color them in looks a little differently. And that's where the custom work comes from.
Got it. We were talking before we went on the air about your role as an improv player. And I have a feeling that this might be an area where there's sort of a structure to improv, but the results and everything inside of it is unique in every performance. Does that help you in this kind of work? Like taking that framework, that structure, that process that you have, and then taking your improv mind and going, yes, and we're going to do it this way for this project.
Yeah. Again, I feel like with improv, there's sort of like rules of the game, like to make sure that you're creating an environment in which people can play. And it's the same thing. So it's the same thing. It's like my building blocks create this environment in which I can play and be creative, yet still be able to produce this work quickly and in an organized way. And so that's how I see it. Absolutely. But yeah, improv has allowed me to be a lot more flexible. And so when things get thrown at me, for example, so in improv, when you play improv, you get suggestions. And sometimes you'll say to the audience, like, hey, give us just one word, throw us one word. And someone throws out carrot or whatever. And now you take carrot and you contextualize carrot to whatever it means to you. And you throw out your initial idea. So you initiate an idea. And all your other players will just build on whatever you initiated. And there's some rules to even that to make sure that your scene sort of makes sense. But from there, like, you just continue to build on it. And so I found that whether I'm in front of a client or I'm, working on any sort of project and someone's throwing out, what about this? Rather than seeing it as like a crink in this plan or being like, oh, that doesn't fit my thing. I just keep myself open to sort of saying like, okay, let me contextualize what this means, what this might mean to their goals and everything. And then sort of like see how we can build upon that or where that fits in, particularly to like, how does that, we could do that, but how does that fit into my budget restraints or the resources I have or this or that? And so everything sort of becomes an option, but one that we have to sort of sit down and say, like, is it feasible, right? Not a question of, is it possible? Like, totally, it's possible. And I think that's the improv part of it. Like, anything is possible, right? Yeah. But there's also this term in improv where it's saying like play to the top of your intelligence. And usually what that means is like, for example, if I am playing as a doctor, I'm not going to do something like so loony that's completely out the confines of what a doctor would do. So I'm not going to play outside the top of my intelligence. And it's the same thing, right? Like, we can come up with all these crazy ideas, but we're still going to we still have to do the one that's feasible, right? So it's the same sort of principle. So yeah, improv is definitely informed a lot. And I think it's just made me be a lot more flexible and sort of like not look at anything as like, oh, it's ruining the plans, Yeah.
I want to stitch that together with something you said earlier about, and this is a common thing that all consultants or practitioners of any kind deal with, is that the idea of setting expectations. And that thing you said about the not going above the top of your intelligence, I forget exactly how you said it. Yeah. It seems like there's some relationship there that like once you sort of set and this is where we're kind of getting back to the importance of strategy, that once you've set, like there's sort of a top level, or like, and the reason I ask this is that so many people, like, they'll see like the way Amazon does e-commerce and they want their little store to do that, or they see the way some social media guru comes across online, they go, oh, I want to just be like that, like that person. And it's like, no, you've got, and that kind of gets both to that idea, that improv idea of setting the ceiling and that setting expectations. Is that an accurate kind of takeaway from that?
Yeah. I would say, I think when you're creating something, you always want it to be the very best that you can be. And so you're always going to look at the complete gold standard and say, I want to be that. And I think that's amazing because it's always going to help you to strive to be better. But you have to be realistic with like where you are today and then also realistic with what it takes for Amazon to be an e-commerce site that runs the way it runs, and HuffPost to be a site that runs the way it runs, and so on and so forth. And it's taking an army of people to run those engines, right? And especially those content engines. And so where you can take those principles, I think is fine, but you also have to know what engine you're running with, right? And to say, how do we continue to incrementally equip ourselves so that we reach that gold standard? And so it is sort of setting those expectations by being really realistic about what does it take for you to produce content in that way. And then once you have that reality, you can start to say like, okay, so I need to be slightly more realistic, but what are certain aspects and principles that I can do today, and see how that operates, and then build upon it. And so like, I always try to set my clients' expectations, because I get that a lot. Like, they'll give me the suggestion of like, you see how she does X, Y, and Z? Like, I really want to be doing that. And it's like, okay, well, let's study what they're doing for that result. And then let's see where you are. And then let's see where we can like fill in those gaps, and like and show where there's a journey for you to progress towards that. Right. And so it's about getting you organized for you to do that. But I think that's where the clear expectation setting comes from. And it starts really early in the relationship about, here's these incremental things that I can do. And each activity we do builds off of the other. Like, if we're doing this workshop where I'm really trying to understand these aspects of your brand story, it's because it's going to help me figure out what you need to say, whether you're on social compared to email, compared to your website, compared to all these different areas. And so that is going to build on the next thing we do. And it's going to build on the next thing we do. And so like, I like to set those expectations and what that journey is going to look like with my client from the start, and letting them know it's going to be a journey. Like, me taking it on your project doesn't mean that in whatever time you contract me for whatever amount of money, I'm going to create Amazon for you, or I'm going to create HuffPost for you, or, but you know, like, you got to just set that and say like, it's a journey to get to that, right? From wherever you are. So, and in some cases, based on what, you know, your audience, you might not need to create something like a HuffPost, or, you know what I mean? So that's a whole other thing, that like, you might be creating your own lane and not even like realize it, because we have to do the work of you getting to know your audience truly. So that's a whole other thing, a whole other possibility.
Exactly. Yeah, I can think of 3 or 4 other conversations to have with you. Hey, we're coming up on time, just a couple, 3 minutes left. I I always give my guests the chance, anything we haven't covered that's on your mind, or that just content strategy, wisdom, or insight that you have that you would like to share with my folks?
I would say, I mean, I think right now it's like an exciting time to be a content strategist, because more and more, I think one thing I keep hearing more and more is like, be human, you know? And it's just like, I understand the what people are saying when they're like, be more human. I think it's more of like, let your interactions be genuine, let them be authentic. Let them show up as you online. And so I think more and more, as people start to figure that out, it's such an amazing time to be a content strategist. And as social media platforms continue to sort of populate, there's this opportunity where everyone can sort of be the media in a way. And as we figure out how that works, there's so much opportunity, I think, for people, specifically content strategists, to define that. And so I think there's an opportunity for us to define what being more human is about. And I think part of what it's about is, how do we sort of check our bias when we're creating and designing things? How do we make sure that we're including the communities that we want to serve in our designs, and in the testing of our designs? And I think it's also really about you sort of like showing up and also just challenging your own self. And then on top of that, I think it's also finding those ways to, like I said, create structures and patterns for the things that you do. So it's like, as you learn to be more authentic, what are sort of the structures and the tenets of that, so that we can be replicating them more and more. Same thing for inclusion. What are the tenets of that, so that we can teach that, and so that the things that we design, those elements just show up more and more and more. So I just think it's a really exciting time to be a content strategist for those reasons.
I agree. I was excited about it too, and now since just your last 2 minutes, I'm 10 times as excited. So thank you.
Yeah,
Thanks so much.
absolutely.
No, you articulated that super well. Well, thanks so much, Malaika. Yeah, it was great having you on, and I literally can think of 10 other things to talk to you about. So maybe I'll hold out the option to maybe call you back at some point.
Oh, that would be great. Thank you so much. I'd love to be back on and chat. It was really good chatting with you.
Thanks so much.
Awesome.
Thank you for listening. Tune in next week for another content strategy interview.